Have you ever received a mysterious envelope? Burned paper, strange symbols, and a signature that, well, you still don't know what it really means. Picture yourself in an office, surrounded by a strange contract, with promises that seem impossible. Yet for some reason, you just can't ignore them. If you want to understand what happened to those who dared to go deeper, don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications, because you won't want to miss the truth behind this pact, something beyond any logical explanation. I thought I was just solving a simple puzzle, but what I found made me question everything. The contract wasn't challenging me, it was choosing me. What happened next, I could never have imagined. When that envelope arrived at my office, something about it immediately bothered me. The yellowed paper, the singed corners. There was something about it that felt old, but at the same time urgent. There was no return address. The person who delivered it was a messenger who vanished before I could ask him anything. When I opened it, I found a partially burned contract. The words, pactum aeternum, were at the top, in Latin. Something inside me whispered to drop it right then, but of course, curiosity always wins out. Along with the contract, there was a short, direct note. Reconstruct the document and interpret its clauses. Who hired me? Why? Questions raced through my mind as I carefully examined the paper. Some parts were legible, and what I saw made me shiver. Exchanges, promises, and a phrase that seemed to jump off the page. Eternal claim. One thing was clear. This was no ordinary contract. And yet, I convinced myself it was just another strange job, maybe from some eccentric collector. I didn't believe in supernatural stories, not until then. As I examined the details, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, as if an invisible presence was filling the space. The handwriting on the document was ritualistic, almost artistic, but carried a disturbing energy. The margins were decorated with symbols I couldn't identify. Something told me to stop, but as a lawyer, I was trained to seek answers, and my mind was already trapped in the effort to decode that puzzle. That's when I realized this contract seemed to have a purpose, and maybe I was part of it. I spent hours trying to decipher the document. I transcribed the legible parts into my computer, trying to fill in the burned sections based on context. It was methodical, almost mechanical, until something strange happened. While I was staring at one of the incomplete sentences, letters began to form on the paper, as if someone were writing with invisible ink. I pulled back immediately, my heart racing. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. "You're just tired," I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the growing fear. But when I opened my eyes, there it was, a sentence I hadn't written. I didn't have the courage to read it aloud, but the words were etched into my mind. "The soul will be claimed for eternity." A chill ran down my spine. I checked the digital analysis tools I was using, looking for rational explanations. Maybe it was some sort of chemical reaction with the old ink, or a visual trick caused by the wear on the paper. But the truth was, I knew this wasn't normal. Still, I pressed on. I'd always believed logic could overcome anything, until that moment. Each word that appeared seemed to bring something else with it. The smell of sulfur began to fill the room, so strong I even opened the windows to try to air it out. With each new sentence I reconstructed, my office felt colder, more hostile. That's when I noticed the symbols on the margins. They began to glow faintly, as if they had a life of their own. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. But I couldn't stop. It was as if something was pushing me to keep going, even though I knew that with every section revealed, I was getting closer to something I could never undo. It was on the third night that everything clicked, and at the same time, it all fell apart. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by piles of papers and translation tools. The contract, now more reconstructed than before, seemed to pulse in front of me, as if it were alive. Some sentences finally started to make sense, but what I discovered took my breath away. It was a pact. Not a business deal, but something ancient, sinister, a pact with a demon. "This can't be real," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew there was something horribly authentic about it. The symbols decorating the margins weren't just decorations. After hours of research, I discovered they were demonic inscriptions, fragments of a ritual that promised power in exchange for something immeasurable, the soul of the signer. And then I realized something that made my heart stop. The signature at the end of the contract, partially burned and illegible, was slowly but surely completing itself in my handwriting. I tried to deny it, tried to laugh off the absurd idea, but the truth was there, clear as day. I had never touched that space, but the name that appeared was mine. Panic took over. I tore the contract into pieces, throwing them in the trash, thinking that would be the end of it. But the smell of sulfur returned, stronger, filling the entire office. The lights started flickering, and for a moment, I thought something was behind me. When I turned around, I only saw shadows dancing on the walls, but they seemed alive, as if they were laughing at me. That's when I heard, for the first time, a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. You've started something you can't stop. I closed my eyes, trying to push the sound away, but it was inside my head, and for the first time, I asked myself, what have I brought into my life? I no longer knew which was worse, the contract or the presence it seemed to bring with it. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the same whisper, soft yet disturbing. Continue. Finish. It was as if the contract wasn't just a piece of paper, but something that was wrapping around me, possessing me. In my office, the smell of sulfur lingered, seeping into every corner. I began to notice that the shadows on the walls seemed denser, as if something was hidden in them, watching. The whispers grew more frequent and clearer. They didn't come only at night. They appeared during the day, while I worked, while I walked around the house. Sometimes they seemed to come from the very contract itself. When I finally gained the courage to open the document again, I noticed something strange. Words I hadn't reconstructed were now perfectly formed. They spoke of irreversible exchanges and a debt that could never be paid in life. That's when I realized the contract wasn't just completing itself, it was growing. It seemed to be feeding off my presence, my energy. I tried to push away the fear with logic. It's exhaustion, I told myself. But the reality was inescapable. The contract seemed to be calling me, as if it needed me to finish it. My mind started playing tricks on me. One time, I swore I saw the letters on the paper rearrange when I glanced at them. Another time, I clearly heard my name being spoken by a voice I didn't recognize. The worst happened when I heard soft knocks coming from the table where it lay, as if something on the other side wanted to break free. More and more, the contract felt like a trap, and I knew that if I continued, I was walking straight into the wolf's mouth. But then, why couldn't I stop? That night, the contract revealed something I'll never be able to forget. As I sat there, staring at those incomplete pages, the air in the office seemed to change. It wasn't just the smell of sulfur. It was denser, heavier, as if the space around me was being filled with something invisible. That's when I heard it again. You know what to do. But this time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was clear, present, and it seemed to come from within me. I closed my eyes, trying to push the sensation away, but it didn't disappear. On the contrary, it grew stronger. I felt as though something was watching me, very closely. Curiosity won once again. I returned to the contract, flipping through the pages slowly, but with a sense of anticipation that made my hands tremble. As I read, I realized something terrible. Each clause seemed to speak directly to me. They mentioned choices I had made, mistakes I had committed in the past, as if the document knew more about me than anyone alive. Then, the burned lines began to form again, just as before, but this time more clearly. At the end of one clause, a sentence froze me in place. This document was made for you. I pulled away from the desk, my breath heavy. This couldn't be possible. I tried to track down the client who had sent the contract. I scoured the records, looked for clues in the envelope, but there was nothing. Then I stumbled upon something even more disturbing. An old news article from years ago about a lawyer who mysteriously disappeared while working on a similar contract. His name was listed as the original author of the pact. The photo in the article was blurry, but something told me I knew him. A chill ran down my spine as an idea solidified. That contract hadn't just been sent to me. It had chosen me. I was starting to believe the contract wasn't just a document. It was an entity, alive and aware. And somehow, it was playing with me. In the days that followed, no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, my mind always returned to that paper. It was as if it were calling me, pulling me back to the desk. The voice in my head began to change. It wasn't just a command to continue anymore. Now it whispered promises. You deserve more. You don't have to live like this. I can give you everything. The idea seemed ridiculous, but it was tempting. My office was buried in debt. I was exhausted, stuck in a routine that seemed to lead nowhere. Who wouldn't accept a quick fix? And that's exactly what the contract offered. I realized that the more I read, the more it spoke to me. It knew my weaknesses, and worse, it knew how to exploit them. One night, as I stared at the nearly completed lines, I saw something new, a clause offering unlimited wealth. The only condition was completing the signature. Sign was the only word highlighted on the page, glowing faintly as if it were pulsing. But it wasn't just promises. There was something else. During the nights, the whispers turned into something darker. If you don't finish, someone else will do it for you. Images began to invade my mind. Images of myself, or at least someone who looked like me, ruined, alone, on the brink of death. The contract wasn't just trying to seduce me, it was threatening me. With each passing moment, it became clearer that it wasn't offering me a choice. Either I completed it, or the contract itself would find a way to fulfill itself. But how could I fight something that shouldn't even exist? Everything began to collapse quickly. In the morning, I woke up with excruciating pain in my chest, as if something had been branded into my skin. I rushed to the mirror, and there it was. A symbol I immediately recognized. It was the same one that decorated the margins of the contract, now etched into my skin like a grotesque tattoo. I tried rubbing it, washing it, even scraping it with a razor, but nothing worked. It was as if it had become part of me. I felt my heart race. "This is just the beginning," the voice whispered. But this time, it wasn't in my head. It was in the room, surrounding me. The contract began to demand its price in ways I could never have imagined. My dreams were taken over by visions of a place that seemed outside of time. A landscape of infinite darkness, with twisted figures and glowing eyes watching me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, and with each passing night, I noticed that the words in the contract were becoming more complete. It was as if it was finishing itself, without my permission. My daily life began to change. The faces of people I knew began to distort, their eyes turning black for brief moments, as if something was closing in around me. Things got worse when I started losing control over my own body. I would pick up the contract, unintentionally, and write on it. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of doing it. That's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The shadows on the walls of my office started to move, and I heard distant, low laughter. My name began appearing more frequently in the contract, scattered between the clauses, as if it were sealing my fate in pieces. Imminent claim. One phrase appeared alone, glowing red at the bottom margin. It was a warning, or perhaps a sentence. And I knew the time was running out. I knew I couldn't go on without understanding what I was facing. The connection to the contract was undeniable, but there was something deeper at play, something that seemed intent on consuming me. I began researching frantically, each clue leading me into a web of disturbing stories. Finally, in a hidden file of old records, I found the name of the original lawyer who had handled the document last. His case was treated as a local curiosity. He had mysteriously disappeared after claiming that a cursed contract had chosen him. Even more disturbing, he had done the same thing I had. He had tried to reconstruct it, unaware that each word would bring his destruction. The contract's history was even older than I imagined. I discovered it had passed from hand to hand, always finding its way to people at moments of desperation. Every person who touched the document had something in common, a deep desire that the contract promised to fulfill: wealth, revenge, power. But the price was always the same: the soul. In forgotten records from a medieval monastery, there were mentions of a demon named Maledictus, known for using contracts as traps to bind his victims. One detail sent a shiver down my spine. One of the clauses mentioned that if someone failed to complete the pact, it would be passed to another chosen one, and the debt would increase. The most terrifying part was that the contract seemed to know my own flaws. Every sentence seemed to speak directly to me, as if it had been shaped to my weaknesses and fears. The disappeared lawyer, according to the stories, had tried to burn the contract, but in doing so, he was found in an unrecognizable state, as though he had been consumed by invisible flames. Now I was trapped in the same snare. With each page I reconstructed, it felt like there was no way out. And worse, I began to wonder, what if the contract wasn't just choosing me? What if it was shaping me for something greater, something I still didn't understand? The contract was nearly complete. Only one line remained. The simplest of all, my signature. For days, I tried to resist, but it seemed useless. Every time I tried to destroy or ignore the document, something happened. Lights flickered, objects fell, or I saw shadows moving in my peripheral vision. The contract was surrounding me, forcing me to choose. But what terrified me even more was the possibility that this wasn't a real choice. Perhaps I had been destined to sign from the moment I touched the burned paper. As I stared at the contract, a heavy feeling overtook the room. The shadows on the walls began to grow, taking forms that looked human, but grotesquely distorted. Voices started echoing, repeating words I'd already read in the document. Pactum eternum. Your soul will be the price. The pressure in my chest was unbearable. That's when he appeared. I don't know how to explain it, but the presence of the demon wasn't physical. It was a force, an absolute darkness that filled the space. I couldn't breathe. He didn't speak, but I knew what he wanted. My signature. Desperate, I tried to destroy the contract once again. I grabbed a lighter, but before the flame could touch it, I felt something cold in my hand, like an invisible chain pulling me back. It cannot be destroyed, a guttural voice whispered in my mind. The contract was invincible, and I knew that if I tried to fight it, something worse would happen. But signing meant condemning my soul. I kept staring at the paper, my hand trembling over the line. This was it. The final choice. Or maybe there was never any choice at all. With the pen in hand, my body began to move on its own while I screamed internally. No! But the ink touched the paper. When the pen touched the paper, something inside me shattered. It wasn't just a simple movement. It was as if a door had opened in my soul, revealing a dark vastness I never knew existed. The world around me warped. Time seemed to slow down, and the sensation of an unbearable weight crushed me. My heart raced, but there was no air in my lungs anymore. There was no space left to breathe. It wasn't just the air that was gone. It was something deeper, darker, my essence, my humanity. I pulled away from the contract, but the paper remained there, motionless, with my name printed in red. Signed. The demon made its presence known then, not as a physical entity, but as an oppressive force, a power that wrapped around every cell of my body. Its laughter wasn't audible, but I felt it in every fiber of my being, as if it was embedded inside me, inside everything. Now you are mine, the voice echoed in my mind, and the realization hit me like a blow. There was no turning back. I no longer belonged to myself. Desperate for relief, I ran to the mirror, but the reflection I saw was no longer mine. Something had infiltrated, distorting my features, as if my own image were shattering. What was looking back at me wasn't a man, but a creature in transition, a void waiting to be filled. My eyes were empty, but within them there was something deep. The weight of the signature consumed me, and the demon, now fully within me, began to shape my mind. I was no longer myself. I was an extension of something that should never have existed. With each passing day, the people around me began to change, but it was hard to say what was wrong. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and curiosity, as if they saw a facade broken from within. When they spoke to me, their faces distorted and their voices became distant, as if I were hearing them from an abyss. There was no longer any connection to the world I once knew. The contract, now a distant memory, still lived in me, pulsing, waiting, like a shadow in my soul that never fades. The nights, the hours, everything dragged on in an eternity I couldn't understand. But something told me that the true pain was only just beginning. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And deep down, I knew. I was no longer a man. I was the mark. I was the consequence. And the thing now hiding inside me, with its grotesque smile that I could no longer control, waited patiently to emerge. And now, here I am, stuck with something I never should have touched. The contract wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a force, a presence that took over my life. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed, was destroyed, and the real pain has just begun. If you thought this mystery was over, think again. What happened to me might just be the beginning. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to keep following this journey because what's coming, you won't want to miss. Now, more than ever, I know, the contract isn't over. It's just beginning, and you might be next.